Okay, it's recording.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is JJ Jackson. I'm a master's candidate here at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program. This is my compatriot.
I'm not Dr. Christy Eldridge, if anyone is wondering. I'm actually signed on as her just so I could record this presentation. My name's Justina, and I'm in my second year at the Chicago School. I'm just getting done with the second year, and I'm starting field work in the fall. For those of you that are new to our presentation, go to the next slide. Oh, so our topic is the influence of nature versus nurture on minority rates of suicidology. So we chose this topic because suicide is a very taboo subject in our cultures. We stay away from discussions regarding feelings and emotions, being emotional, or expressing feelings is viewed as a sign of weakness in our cultures. And we're taught from childhood to really present with a very stoic affect. You're not supposed to really show any type of emotion at all. Like, even though if it was considered like a positive emotion, like sometimes when you're happy, you know, people in my culture really just kind of nod their heads. They don't really smile or anything like that. And suicidal ideations, attempts, and people who are committing suicide, it's really kind of unheard of in our culture. And it's usually considered a dishonor to ourselves or our families. And our culture views individuals who are having suicidal ideations as people who are crazy or are very different than normal people, whatever that actually means. And in our culture, or at least in my culture, what we do is we light incense, and I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but they're kind of like sticks that smell a specific way, and you light them, and you're supposed to light them because when you light them, whoever you're lighting them for your ancestor, it'll bring your ancestors to you so that your ancestors could rid the demons from your body. So basically, that's what happens if someone from my culture presented with suicidal ideations or they've had suicidal attempts. And despite suicide being a cultural taboo, minorities are still committing suicide. And I was really shocked to learn that the suicide rate for Asian Americans is actually a lot higher than African Americans because there's a lack of research for suicide regarding Asians in general and the topic of suicide. And it could be assumed that Chinese Americans are committing suicide, and there's just a lack of research because our cultural beliefs have taught us to keep it to ourselves. So whether we have suicidal ideations, whether we've committed suicide, those are personal topics that we literally do not share with anybody. And I mean anybody. That would mean like close friends and family members. Our research taught us about non-suicidal self-injury behaviors that are a precursor and warning for future suicidal ideations and attempts. And these non-suicidal self-injury behaviors are behaviors where individuals do not have the intent to kill themselves, yet they're harmed. So a perfect example of this is if an individual uses an eraser to burn his or her skin because, you know, that causes harm, yet the person probably didn't have the intent to kill themselves while doing that. And approximately 37% of college level students who engage in non-suicidal self-injury behaviors also have attempted to commit suicide. So this is why we believe that it's crucial to discuss how the nature and nurture aspects influence minority rates of suicidologies. So we have some general terms within our presentation. So when we refer to nature, we're talking about genetics, and genetics could translate into DNA, personality traits, the way we look, and our abilities. And when we discuss nurture, we're referring to environment, which includes upbringing, life experiences, and learned behavior. And I think a really important component of the nurture aspect is trauma, because a lot of the issues that stem from having suicidal ideations, attempting to commit suicide, or being a survivor of someone who attempted suicide includes a lot of trauma. Another term we have is suicidology, which is ultimately the study of suicide and suicidal behavior. And this also includes suicide prevention. So a lot of people don't know that there's actually an American Association of Suicidology, which is a very, very good resource for information about suicidology. They have a website that's, you can go to it at www.suicidology.org. And the website is, I mean, I can't even describe it because they have so many resources on their website, but they have resources for basically everything suicide related. So for individuals who have suicidal ideations, have attempted suicide, or are loved ones of someone who committed suicide, or are individuals who are survivors themselves. They also provide training for clinicians in a variety of settings, including correctional facilities, schools, hospitals, even counselors' offices. And when we refer to minorities throughout our presentation, we are referring specifically to Asian Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. We thought about considering including all minorities in general, but that really just takes a long time, and for the sake of the time that we have during our presentation, we decided just to include those three. So suicide is the 6th leading cause of death for African Americans, ranging from ages 25 to 32. And in the United States, the suicide rate is approximately 10.9 per every 100,000. So among Hispanic Americans, the suicide rate is approximately 5.7 per 100,000. And among Asian Americans, the suicide rate is approximately 5.4 per 100,000. And for African Americans, the suicide rate is 5.3 per 100,000. So the research did show that Asians in general do not seek mental health services at all, regardless if it's free or not. And this is really dangerous because the cross cultures that make Asians very high risk for mental health issues. And research has shown that acculturation and collectivism are the 2 leading causes in which Asians are not seeking mental health services. So if you go to the next slide, we actually have 2 video clips for you. And I don't know if the picture looks familiar for anyone, but the first picture is of Sung Hui Cho. And before we play the video, I just want to give you a brief synopsis of who he is. So some of you might know him because he's known as the mass shooter in the Virginia Tech massacre. And his family immigrated to the United States from South Korea and settled in Centreville, Virginia. And as a child, he was bullied by other kids, and he was often considered a loner. And this progressed throughout his middle school days, high school, and eventually college. And as a student at Virginia Tech, he wrote dark and gruesome poems and stories. He was accused of stalking 2 female students. He had to be removed from classes. He was taking inappropriate pictures of other female classmates. and he was also taken to a psychiatric hospital and placed on a 5150 hold following a suicidal statement that he had made to his roommate. He was court ordered to attend counseling, although research has shown that they can only prove that he attended one counseling session. And on April 16th, 2007, he killed 32 people and wounded many others as he went classroom to classroom shooting his classmates. He then proceeded to commit suicide by shooting himself in the head. JJ, can you play that video? Let's see if it works. So while he's trying to pull up the video, just a reminder for everyone who's in our presentation, if your name is not listed in your full name, please list that in the chat box so I can put you down as an attendee of this presentation.
Hi, I'm Katie Couric. Welcome to Eye to Eye. Virginia Tech gunman Cho's son, Quee, was sending out clues about his mental stability long before Monday's shooting rampage that killed 32 people and, of course, the killer himself. Graphic writing so disturbing, she expressed her concerns to the school. Sharon Alfonsi spoke to Roy about Cho's behavior in the classroom.
Tell us how you got to know son Cho.
I had him in a class of 300 students in spring of 2004. I was teaching the class because at the time we had budget cuts and it was hard for students to get classes, so I decided to teach an extra large section, and so he was in that. But I required some writing from all of the students, so I got to see a little bit of his work then. And then in fall 2005, Nikki Giovanni brought him to my attention. She's a faculty member in English and, of course, the famous poet, and she was having some problems with him, so she asked me if I would look into it, and I was chair of the English department at the time.
What kind of problems?
He'd written something for class that we both thought seemed very angry and inappropriate, and he was also taking cell phone pictures of students underneath the table, and that was problematic too.
What kind of pictures was he taking?
I assumed they were just meant to be candid kind of expose photos, but the students were not being asked, of course, if they could do that. So I wrote him a note just saying how inappropriate that was and why it wasn't the kind of thing you ought to be doing. And then he wrote back to me with a very strange, I thought, very ardent response in defense of himself.
What did he say?
There were a number of different things he said, but mainly he was defending himself in a way that I felt seemed to be still very angry, still very inappropriate in terms of his tone. It's not the way you would speak to a professor or about a professor. And so I felt I needed to call him in and talk with him.
How would you characterize his writing?
I only saw a limited amount of his writings. I never saw the plays, for example. It wasn't that class that I was dealing with. But I think clearly from his writings, he seemed to be someone who was going through quite a lot of difficulty, which is why I wanted to alert people to it.
And you tried to alert who?
I alerted the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, who were very responsive, of course, and then counseling, the Virginia Tech Police, and Student Affairs.
And what was the response of the police?
They were immediately tried to be helpful and tried to see if there was anything, because I sent all the documentation, if there was any overt threat in the documentation. And they felt, unfortunately, and I could see why when I read it, that there was not an overt threat. And so their hands were tied to some extent, although they offered to send security if Nikki wanted to meet with him in class. and she decided against it. She did not want to meet with him. And unfortunately, the only option I was given was to offer him an equivalent experience. And that would either mean transferring him to another class, which I felt would be very uncomfortable for students, or taking him myself, so I decided on the second option.
You've been a teacher for more than 20 years here. How many times have you ever had to call the police about one of your students, or how many times have you ever called the police about a student?
Twice.
Twice. So what was it about him that you said something is not right here?
Sometimes, if you've been in teaching a long time, you begin to recognize certain signs, and it gets you very worried. I actually thought, as soon as I called him in and spoke with him, and he was wearing the dark glasses and wouldn't take them off.
He was wearing what?
Dark glasses. He wore sunglasses indoors almost all the time, and a hat on his head, and just, you could hardly see his face, but it was clear he seemed so depressed. And so I just knew that there was something that was clearly wrong. So I wrote a little summary of what I'd seen and what I observed, and why I thought he seemed to be very depressed.
Did he seem just lonely or just depressed, or did he seem angry as well?
His work seemed to suggest that he was angry. And as I say, I hadn't seen the plays until just they were posted on the net, and I saw them the other day. But even the limited amount that I saw seemed angry. And there's anger that almost all students feel, and they get frustrated. Sometimes they're young people. And then there's a deeper kind of anger that seems to come from a place that you don't usually find in a student. And it seemed to me, anyway, and I was not a professional, so, I'm not a professional psychiatrist or psychologist, but that was something we ought to really look at very, very carefully.
So based on this video, how do you think that Sung Hui Cho would fit the criteria for nature and nurture affecting his decision to commit suicide? So can someone name all the criteria of how nature affected his decision to commit suicide? You can unmute yourself to answer the question. No one can name the criteria for how nature affects his decision to commit suicide. So remember, nature would include his genetics, his personality traits, the way he looked, and his abilities. Sherry, were you going to answer? You unmuted yourself.
I was. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Sherry.
Well, when you were discussing culture and how culture sometimes play a role in whether or not you voice what you feel, whether or not you describe, show your emotions out in public. And then what he was going through kind of had everything internal. So regardless of what was being said, or regardless of how, the approaches were, I saw that he looked this way. I saw that, he may have been going through things. Then culturally, you may not want to display that because that's just the way you are.
So would someone besides Sherry be able to name all the criteria for how nurture affected his decision to commit suicide?
Well, because he's Asian American, and you stated earlier that they typically do not seek assistance with mental issues.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that can be like I guess a nurture reason. But I mean, honestly, I would have to know more of his background, like what happened with his family and all that stuff, I think, to really say anything else other than socially, he was kind of like a loner.
Mm-hmm.
And seemed different, like wearing black and the unusual behaviors that he displayed.
Mm-hmm. So, Tanisha, you and Sherry both bring up very good points in terms of how his culture and also how nature and nurture really affected his decision to commit suicide, because we have all these different factors in play, right? Not only just kind of how his personality traits were, but really at the way that he looked to himself and to other people, and his behaviors, you know, the culture that he grew up in, his life experience, being bullied, not fitting in, kind of being a loner. So all those things come into play when we look at how all these things affected his decision to commit suicide. JJ, can you pull up the presentation again? No.
So the next video, I'll make sure like we'll see like a couple minutes of this, but I'm not sure if you all are familiar, but Khalif Browder. He was a 16-year-old male that was accused of stealing a backpack. And while he was awaiting trial, he was held at Rikers Island. And two out of the 3 years, he was held in solitary confinement, which if most people are not familiar with prison structure, with correctional structure, is when he spent up to, well, he spent exactly 23 hours in a cell confined, and they come out for 1 hour a day. So we can imagine just the impact that could have had on a 16-year-old who never had an engagement with law enforcement. You can imagine. So we're gonna take a look at a couple minutes of this video. If I can get this thing up. All right. And he also, once he was released, a couple years after he was released, he attempted suicide multiple times while he was in Rikers Island, but he did not complete suicide until he was released a couple years later by hanging. And so we want to look at a couple minutes just for you to get the synopsis of what was going on, and then we'll have some questions and discussions about it. Can you all hear it?
News that Khalif Browder has committed suicide. He was a young New York student who spent 3 years in Rikers Island jail without being convicted of a crime. Saturday, Khalif took his own life at his home in the Bronx, 3 years old. In 2010, when he was just 16, he was sent to Rikers Island without trial on suspicion of stealing a backpack. Earlier this year, the New Yorker obtained explosive video showing the violence to which Khalif was subjected to there. Surveillance camera footage shows him being abused on 2 separate occasions. In one clip from 2012, the teenager was seen inside Rikers Central Punitive Segregation Unit, better known as the BING. As a guard escorts Khalif to the showers, Khalif appears to speak, and then the guard suddenly violently hurls him to the floor, although he's already handcuffed. In a separate video clip from 2010, Khalif is attacked by almost a dozen other teenage inmates after he punches a gang member who spat in his face. The other inmates pile onto Khalif and pummel him until guards finally intervene. Khalif's case led to calls for reforming New York's criminal justice system.
On the night of his arrest years ago, Khalif Browder was walking home from a party with his friends in the Bronx, May 15, 2010, when he was stopped by police based on a tip that he had robbed someone weeks earlier. He told HuffPost Live what happened next.
They had searched me, and the guy actually, at first he said I robbed him, I didn't have anything on me. And that's when nothing in your weapon and none of his stuff. Weapon, no money, anything that I let him rob me for. So the guy actually changed up his story and said that I actually tried to rob him, and then another police officer came and they said that I robbed him 2 weeks prior, and then they said we're gonna take you to the police here, and most likely we're gonna let you go home, and then I never went home.
That's right. Khalif Browder did not return home for 33 3 months, almost 3 years, even though he was never tried or convicted. For nearly 800 days of that time, he was held in solitary confinement. He maintained his innocence, requested a trial, but was only offered plea deals while the trial was repeatedly delayed. Near the end of his time in jail, the judge offered to sentence him to time served if he entered a guilty plea and told him he could face 15 years in prison if he was convicted. He refused to accept the plea deal, was only released when the case was dismissed. We're joined once again by Jennifer Gunnerman, reporter, author, contributing editor at New Yorker magazine. She was the first to report Khalif's suicide in her obituary for the New Yorker magazine on Sunday. She first recounted Khalif Browder's story last year in her article, Before the Law. A boy was accused of taking a backpack. The courts took the next 30 years of his life. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Is it fair to say that the courts and the prison system actually took his life?
Well, I don't know what was going through Khalif's mind in those last 2 minutes, but it's without a doubt that he was completely traumatized by those 3 years that you talked about when he was trapped on Rikers Island, despite never having been convicted of a crime, brutalized by officers and fellow inmates alike, as your viewers saw in that video footage that you guys showed.
Now, he had.
Okay, so I'm going to pause it here just for the sake of time, just to have some discussion. So it was something that he said that was in the actual, that was in an article. And what he said, because he tried to attempt suicide multiple times. And then after his release, they said his symptoms of depression persisted. And he said, I quote, "People tell me because I have this case against the city, I'm all right. But I'm not all right, I'm messed up. I know that I might see some money from this case, but that's not going to help me mentally. I'm mentally scarred right now. That's how I feel. Because there are certain things that changed about me and they might not go back." He also said, before I went to jail, I didn't know a lot about a lot of stuff. And now that I'm aware, I'm paranoid. I feel like I was robbed of my happiness. So as you all think about that, how could you consider, or what are some instances, just some brief instances of the effect of nature versus nurture? Was there more influencing like his suicide attempts and his eventual completion? Was one weighing more on him than the other? Consider race, consider class, consider engagement with the law. What are your thoughts?
For me personally, I think he stated it best himself. He was robbed. You take a look at his life prior to going into the type of environment that he was in. I mean, he had already stated that it wasn't perfect. You know, I don't have a perfect life. I'm not this. I'm you know, already have these type of emotions that I'm going through. And then to be placed into a prison and being innocent and actually going through constant trauma. So he was correct. Money can't solve things in the way people view other things as far as into the nurture part. You didn't nurture him at all. You robbed him of what he could have been or what he could have done in society as far as to what he felt. And it's quite, it's sad and is different types of emotion, anger, different things that people do to children, because we have to realize this was a child that we're talking about. So when you put a child inside of an environment, yes, he came from a nature of possibly mishap. We truly don't know exactly, you know, his full story. But when you take that and you try to nurture a child inside of a prison, your end results are traumatized, are mental instability. And that's exactly, he to me, he stated it perfectly. I was robbed.
Yeah, that's a great point. I also want to keep in mind that nurture, again, are those environmental contexts. Right, like I said, he was not engaged with the correction system, never had engagement or charge like that, and then to have to be thrust into a whirlwind of feelings and an environment of solitary confinement, not only just regular like open population, but solitary confinement for something that he did not do, and then that thrust into a eventual tumultuous whirlwind of mental health issues, depression, the suicide attempts and then the eventual completion. So it definitely, as you can see, that's a pretty plain situation where nature and nurture verse both had an effect upon this minority who's from a lower SES. And you know, so who else has a thought before we move on to our case meetings? Anyone else?
Sherry, you brought up a very great point, and so did you, Jackson. According to the National Institute for Mental Health, as Sherry stated, between the ages of 15 to 24, when a person is incarcerated and placed into prison as the confinement, the history of suicidal ideation increases by about 6%. And in addition, if that is not addressed, the medical illness or the mental illness is going to increase, and the chances of them fully completing suicide is at a 6.8. And that is very profounding, and for lack of a better word, is eye-opening, because for someone to be placed in there at that precise age 15, and he was there for 3 years, just hitting the mark of 18 and being isolated, that also added to it. So the 4 main components of suicidal ideation was all given to him in that little time, being exposed to in that little time, and the most peak time of his life. So that is very concerning.
And this is something that, you know, this is rather explicit and rather overt, but we want us as clinicians to understand, you know, the instances or the lives that we're going to be engaging with. And so we may assume, we may know the background of one individual, may assume, but we want to make sure that we're aware of, you know, the other identities that may be in place. So we'll go back to the presentation. I think we'll have time for maybe 2 vignettes for Justina and the questions maybe. And you're on mute, Justina, by the way.
Sorry. Let me see. Sorry, my screen's like frozen right now. There we go. Okay. So we came up with a few vignettes, just case vignettes for you guys, and we wanted to really make this interactive because we want to elicit from you what are the nature or nurture or cultural aspects of each case that really affects how someone views suicide, as well as like the factors that we need to take into consideration for individuals who do attempt to commit suicide or commit suicide. So the first case vignette is of Mel. So Mel is a 62-year-old Hispanic male who has been coming to counseling with tears in his eyes. He is married to Lori, who favors their adult children when Mel is more assertive. So Mel does not work and relies on his Social Security check and disability each month. He is very active in his church. However, he suspects that the pastor at his church is giving his wife too much attention. Mel has many health issues, including diabetes, hepatitis C, cirrhosis of the liver, and gastrointestinal hemorrhaging. He has a difficult time keeping up with his doctor's appointments and sometimes forgets to attend important appointments. He believes his children are waiting for him to die. Prior to seeking counseling, Mel was incarcerated for over 20 years, including solitary confinement. He has a history of abusing heroin and depression. His father was also incarcerated and committed suicide while in prison. Mel feels guilty for missing his father's funeral because he was not allowed to attend due to his prison sentence. So based on just that synopsis, think about the questions that are on the slide. So how important is race when considering Mel's presenting symptoms? how could his incarceration influence his current presentation and involvement in his church? Is church a support system or something that hinders him? Does anyone want to share their thoughts?
Well, I think you said that Hispanics have about a 5.4 or 5 point something suicide rate. So I would definitely want to consider that. The fact that he has depression and some severe medical diagnoses would make me want to. Those things coupled his ethnicity, his medical history, and like his current like depressive state would make me think that yes, he has a very high he's a high risk for suicide, as well as the fact that it seems like he may think that his wife and pastor have something going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I would definitely be concerned that he may be at risk for suicide.
Tanisha, that's a great point. This case vignette is actually based off of a real client, and this client, you're absolutely correct, this client had a history of depression, and he also had a history of suicide attempts, specifically when he believed that his wife was having an affair with the pastor of his church, which really affected him because he was very, very involved in his church, and religion was very important to him. So he felt that, in a sense, she sort of robbed him the opportunity to be who he was.
Also, I'm sorry. Also, he, based on the vignette, he exhibits, I would say, 5 of the warning signs for suicidal ideations. He feel guilt for for missing his father's funeral, the use of alcohol, the use of being for him being withdrawn from his family, as you indicated, as well as him actually displaying extremely sadness when he's showing up to a session with tears in his eyes. So at this moment, I believe implementing an assessment and actually assessing that aspect of his suicidal ideations, because it's in his family, and just addressing it, but being sensitive to the language being used as well as his culture aspect. Because as a male, based on what you indicated, as a male, he feel that he has lost that role of being a protector or being involved in the family at the higher hierarchy, because Hispanic culture, the male seems to be the provider, the protector, and he feels that he has lost that with his family, especially not being involved with his kids and his wife. So.
I would just wanted to address the question about how being involved in the church right after his incarceration and how that might have affected it. Because they said that he was incarcerated for 20 years, was it? And that he was in isolation for a lot of that as well. So he goes from that kind of environment where he's isolated into a church environment where it's very community-based and collectivist and everything. I could understand why he latched onto it as much as he did. And when he started suspecting his pastor and his wife going behind his back, why that could really mess with his head in a sense, and feel like a betrayal in a lot of different aspects of his life, especially if the pastor kind of symbolizes the whole belief, in a sense, the whole belief system. And that was what he was so dependent on and so latching on to keep him going, or to keep him give him a sense of purpose after he got out. So yeah, just thought that was interesting.
Thank you for sharing. For the sake of time, we're going to move on to our second case vignette. JJ?
Okay. Did you want me to do the second one, or just?
You could just pick whichever one you want to do. You could just pick whichever one you want to do.
So let's go to Jody's case. All right. Pull up the case from y'all. Okay, so Jody is a Taiwanese American college student. She is 29 years old. She is seeking counseling because she was pregnant and had an abortion. Jody uses methamphetamines to give her energy. Jody comes from a fairly wealthy family. Her father hired a nanny to take care of her. Jody tells you that she spends a lot of time in her bathroom and stay away from her father. She believes she is a burden to her family. Her father suggested she move in with her mother, and she doesn't want to leave. She doesn't know what to do and tells you that she has nothing to live for. So as you consider that vignette, some questions I wanted to prompt you all to think about is, consider intersectionality. How is this vignette contrary to dominant research about what will be the, quote unquote, risk factors for suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation? So keep in mind race, class, wealth, and culture. And how would suicide intervention be different? Is this a passive SI or is this overt? I want to know your thoughts.
What did you say her ethnicity or race was again, please?
Taiwanese, so she's Asian. She's an Asian American. And she's 29 and seeking counseling because she was pregnant and had an abortion. She uses substances that she say gives her energy. Her father hired a nanny to take care of her. She comes from a fairly wealthy family. She believes she's a burden to her family. She doesn't know what to do and tells you that she has nothing to live for.
I think it's very high. I don't know if it's like overt, but it's a very high indication of suicide in her case. She's like it's high among Asians. It's high among it can be high among people who are have come from a high SES, just because they typically feel like in those types of situations when they shame their families, that that's like a huge deal. And then for her father to be suggesting that she leave, that's kind of like almost like an ultimate shame. And then also the substance abuse and the whatever feelings she may have regarding that abortion.
So something that Justina alluded to earlier, given the demographic of Asian Americans, that they don't seek, well, for the most part, they don't seek mental health services. So how would your approach be different than someone else, than another background? And how would you understand the concept of nature versus nurture in this case?
I just want to make sure everybody heard the question that JJ asked, because at least on my end, he kind of came in and out a little bit. So did everybody hear exactly what he asked?
Cut off.
Okay.
Yeah, cut off.
I'm sorry.
I was trying to, I'm like, did I hear him?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the question I asked was, how would your intervention be different with her, given what we know about most Asian Americans do not readily seek counseling or seek mental health services? How would your approach be different with her, and how would your knowledge of the concept of nature versus nurture influence your intervention or your treatment or your relationship with her as a counselor?
Well, I know this theory is not actually utilized with trauma. However, the one theory that came to mind was the solution focused modality, because in that moment, highlighting her strengths, letting her know, I applaud you for actually showing up here, because I know it's very difficult for you to get here and express these, and actually illuminating the fact that she got there and her strengths for even going forward and seeking help. That is one step towards treatment. As Nurek put it, the modalities for trauma varies based on people in the environment. And at this moment, both her culture, her environment plays a major role in that. And few methods for going forward with that is actually finding her strengths and highlighting that. And as she said, she does not know, she has nothing to live for, actually putting in the aspect of a probing question or a miracle question. If you say you don't have anything to look for, what does that look like? What does that mean for you? How can you go ahead and picture that? And probe, and then the next aspect will be, as we address this, with all of these going on, what would life look like if de-stressor was not there? At going ahead and actually having her make her narrative, but also being a collaboration where you can actually draw on her strengths and give her hope. Because when people feel hopeless in that moment, they have a tunnel vision, nothing else matters. So going forward.
I'm sorry to interrupt. How would you take her voice in there to you saying, well, I don't have anything to live for? How would you take that? Would you think, and consider her culture, do you think it would be passive SI, like she doesn't really mean that she wants to harm herself? Or do you think explicit SI, like how would you do that?
I would take it very serious because my husband is Asian, and for personal disclosure, and they are not people who express emotions. They are not people who fully wear the emotions on the sleeve. They are very private. So for her to break that culture aspect, that culture barrier, and come forward and express that, that is something I'm really going to take forward with her and actually go more within the arts therapy realm, because working with those population, having them visualize it, and also going ahead with the CBT with her distorted thoughts. How can I go ahead and merge those two? Now you have expressed this. I understand you have expressed this. I'm glad you have expressed this. But if you have nothing to live for, let's put this into perspective. You came here today. You don't want to let your parents down. How does that look like? What you are in school, next assignment, pretty much putting things together in her book that is important. Have her check it on a scale of 1 to 10. How often do you feel this? Where do you feel it? And just putting a mind-body connection with it, I believe, with most of people with this population, actually giving them the tools to go back and challenge themselves, and also being a collaborative relationship where they are involved, actually go ahead and contradict what they are actually saying. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no. That's a great consideration, and I want to make sure that you're mindful, which you were, of the fact that just because someone expresses it, there's a cultural difference. So within Asian communities, oftentimes there's a lack of communicating or being overly vocal about emotions. So for her to admit something like that, you would take it very seriously. So I was making sure to see where you were, but that's great considerations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should we?
Does anyone have any questions for us?
Or any concluding thoughts? Or
I do. I know we were talking about nature and nurture, but I did want to make a point, because I think most of in the scenarios we talked about the use of drugs, or the use of different types of ways that you can possibly have already a plan to commit suicide. And I know we didn't discuss it, but there is a huge difference as far as to how males commit suicide and how females commit suicide as far as to the gender. So discussing gender-wise and looking at some of the nature versus nurture, and how just wanted to get your thoughts on as far as to how nature and nurture may have a huge impact on what you choose to select as a tool if you were looking to end your life.
I think for the most part, at least within my research, I found that males tend to they tend to choose like more violent options for suicide. So a lot of weapons that are used would be like guns, knives or ropes to hang themselves. Women used less violent terms of committing suicide, such as like ingesting pills or, well, no, slitting your wrist, that's not less violent. But the research that I did, a lot of women tend to go that route. Does that answer your question, Sherry?
A little bit. I was trying to get, the reason why people may choose. I guess because, if I'm looking, if I have someone to come in for counseling, and I'm asking questions, if I'm looking at a female, it's not realistic for me to think that, because women normally choose pills or women normally choose slitting their wrists or what people may call softer ways of committing suicide, that if she's carrying a gun, she has if she has access to a gun, I kind of need to get out of that mode of thinking and know that, nature and nurture play a role, not just, thinking that, okay, because they're male, because she's female, she's going to choose something else. And that's what I was trying to get those barriers as far as to in your research. See anything where nature and nurture played a role in choice.
So help answer that, Sherry. I was just looking up the question you said, and the one thing that came out, most male, we live in a patriarchal society where male are masculine, and even our language is masculine. And most male believe that if they do not complete that, they are a failure even more. So they go for the more drastic aspect, because the nurture aspect of it, I am on suicidalideationacademic.org, and it states that the current population is much higher within the Asian community that are in Hong Kong versus those that are in China, versus those that are in other Asian cultures and communities, because the gap between the male and female expectation is a lot higher. So as a result, in order to complete a task, they have to complete it to the fullest of their ability. And they have a higher percentage of completing suicide with a most drastic and deadly aspect. Nevertheless, female are now taking on that role as failure versus being female are not taking on the role as, what's the language to use? Female are not taking on the role as professionals, in addition to also being a protector and a caregiver.
So now, I'm sorry. So research has shown that it's no longer that the growth is now choices being both male and female gender. There's no longer a difference in gender as far as to selection. It's the will.
Yeah. And I also want you just to keep in mind that, I mean, if a person is expressing suicidal thoughts and ideation too, you just take it and be present with that person. I mean, I think it's good to have a background of what is more commonly chosen across differentiated across gender, but largely, we know that each experience is different. So we shouldn't be shocked if a female decides, or a female-bodied person decides to choose a gun, or as her plan. We should take it as serious, but we shouldn't invalidate it because she's not using something that we assume to be something a choice for suicide at all. Just be present with the client. Should be.
And that's a good point you bring, Jackson. I'm sorry for cutting you off. It also make that very clear. The social culture and conditions should not impact a counselor view, because this aspect is individualism. It's actually individuality. Most people view suicide differently. It's part of culture or environment. So taking that into consideration, that there is not cookie cutter. Everyone does not fit in a box. So treating each person as a person.
I will also want to put out there that if someone is already using substances, that's a red flag too, because that is a way that people commit suicide, through overdose.
Very good point. To be mindful of everyone's time, does anyone have any other questions or thoughts that they'd like to share before we conclude this presentation? No one? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming to our presentation and for sharing all your thoughts. We appreciate it.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you guys. Awesome. Awesome job.
Great job.
Talk to y'all soon. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, bye.
Bye.